So just to start our meeting off in a good way, I'm going to do a land acknowledgement. In the hope of starting this meeting off in a good way, we, the Reconciliation Action Group, wish to acknowledge that this workshop is taking place on Treaty 7 territory. This is the ancestral home to the Blackfoot Confederacy, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai. The Stoney Nakoda First Nations, including the Siksika, the Chiniki, the Bearspaw Wesley First Nations, and the Tsuut'ina First Nation. It also includes the Blackfeet, who live south of the colonially imposed border. We would also like to acknowledge the Métis Nation, Region 3, who make this area their home, as well as the many Inuit and all Indigenous people living across Turtle Island. We would like to acknowledge that the settlers among us benefit from colonial practices that have directly relied on the exploitation of Indigenous people of this land, as well as the abuse of the animals, soil, water, plants, and air that local Indigenous communities have been caring for and protecting for thousands of years. At this time, we stand with all Indigenous people in their grief, rage, and upheaval, and commit to keep fighting alongside you for justice. And finally, we wish to acknowledge that we are committed to a continuous process of learning and unlearning about our true shared histories, the effects of ongoing colonial violence, and the legacy of Indigenous resistance to this violence. It is so meaningful to be joining you all in the spirit of true reconciliation.
I'd like to introduce Elder Adrian Wolflag. He is from the Siksika Nation, and he has trained tens of thousands of people across Canada and into Europe, and he is also a published researcher. His preference is sharing the stories and teachings his elders taught him with individuals and groups. You may have seen him at the Calgary Stampede Indian Village, the Downtown Library Elders Circle, the Glenbow Museum, or at various community gatherings. Here he is with an opening blessing.
Good evening, and thank you for your kind invitation for me to attend. And there's been a lot of things happening, and even the renaming is something that, it takes a while, and it has some real heavy challenges just to go through. And with the children that have been found recently, the numbers are going up, we know. And it's something that we've been part of the community we've been working with for a while now. I remember 15 years ago, just on the south side of town here, repatriating some of them to new coffins because the weather had, the river had eaten away at the banks, and some of the coffins had slid, and moving them. And we learned at that time that their cause of death wasn't linked 100% to what was written. Because one young boy, official cause of death was exposure, but moving him from the coffin to another one, there was a hole that actually they left the part off that he died from exposure to a rifle at close range. And a young girl, 7 years old, who officially died because she ate too many berries. So spring, summer, I go check out Costco, Walmart, Superstore, all the places, just to see if they have their signs out warning people that if they eat too many berries, it could kill them. Because officially that's what happened to this young lady. And when we look at these places, it's not someplace foreign. It's someplace very close to home, because my parents went there, my grandparents went there, my aunts and uncles who are my aunt from BC, this is her home. My aunt from Saskatchewan, there was some found in her home. And so it's people that have been missing from our daily lives. And when I was younger, I had grew up at one of the schools. I was you see them, you know them, and you hear some really horrible things. But I'd like to, keep this positive. And I did receive some tobacco that I'll be offering. And I just wanted to put that out there that as much as I appreciate being here, I have had a bit of a busy day. I've adjusted my schedule so I could be here just because some sisters of mine are with the group that had asked so graciously. But, doing work with families that are connected to some of them, and for I do have to take care of myself too. So I will be leaving before the end of the sessions conclude, but I will be taking the tobacco out, and as is tradition, be offering before the sun sets and remembering those that have been disturbed at this time, and ask Sister our mother to keep them close, to watch over them. And we pray that they may be at peace, that their families may be at peace, because it's a double-edged sword to, when they're identified, to finally be able to move forward. But then it also rips off all the bandages and everything else that you had protected yourself with. So it is a challenge. And having had family members that were part of the missing, and some of them were found, others are still out there. It brings everything back. So it is a really hard time. So I do ask that when you work with our population, just remember that it takes a while to be able to be ready to talk when you were connected to that baby, when you were connected to that person. And when you've been afraid of the dark for so many years that when you see a room, you can't enter it. You have to reach as far as you can for the light switch, because to go into that room brings you back to a time when you had no control and you were hurt. So I appreciate the efforts to move forward and to move in a good way. And, even some of the words that were good initially that were taken and made into something hurtful, like squaw, that became so horrible, so denigrating, but can also be brought back. My adopted aunt in Edmonton started an association, and for more than a couple of decades has honored women with the renaming and the reclaiming. So instead of squaw, she brought it back to esqueo, connected to the creator, bringer of life, force of love, which is a good thing. And so just because something is written a certain way or is written in stone and on walls doesn't mean it's forever, because forever is a long time. And when we look here, we look at our mother. She's kept our secret. She's protected us for a long time, because even here in Calgary, there's a dig that goes back 10,000 years. And they found the articles, and they were able to assess the articles and check them out. And the artifacts, they found out that they were of Blackfoot origin. And so they've asked me, because I've been working with them over the years, and I advised them, keep digging, because it's a bit longer than that. And so when you look at the history of the peoples, and like, for instance, the Blackfoot people, the traditional lands just a couple hundred years ago, from the north to the south, they were over 250,000 square miles. That's like bigger than Alberta. And can you imagine any place else in the world with people managing that big a section of land, but honoring it, protecting it, stewarding, taking care for the future? But going back to today, I just want you to give thanks in your own way. I want to thank the youth for their gracious introduction and for acknowledging the land, acknowledging our mother. But I pray for all of you, but also pray for those that whose peace has been disturbed, as I said, even though we hope it's for a good purpose, because it's a rallying, it's an awakening for all of us. And I would ask that the camera not be recording at this time, because the prayer is offered and we don't hang on to it and we don't keep it.
Thank you, Elder Wolfleg. We would now like to introduce Christina Bird. Christina Bird is of mixed descent, identifying as Cree Métis. Her family has roots in the Red River. O Pasquayac, Cree Nation, Ireland, and Scotland. She is a second-generation social worker who recently completed her clinical specialization. When she is not working, she likes to spend time with her family, friends, and dog Jax. Christina will be available for anyone who needs support during the workshop. You can reach her by contacting the host through chat. She will then send you a separate breakout room with Christina.
Then we'd like to introduce Dr. Crystal Fraser. Crystal Gale Fraser is a Gwich'aya Gwich'in, sorry if I botched that pronunciation, and an assistant professor of history at the University of Alberta. Her PhD research focused on the history of students' experiences at Indian residential schools in the Inuvik region between 1959 and 1996. With her partner and young daughter, Crystal has lived on Treaty 6, homeland of the Métis Nation, since 2004.
Thanks so much for that introduction. Should I take it over from here? Yeah, okay. I just want to say brilliant job on the land acknowledgement. Thank you so much, Elder, for your prayers and your wise words. I think we're all feeling that right now, that we need to look after ourselves and find a good place. It's really my pleasure to be here. Showi Crystal Gale Fraser Vilji. My name is Crystal. I'm Gwich'aya Gwich'in, Treaty 11, originally from Inuvik and Dechencho Genjik in the Northwest Territories. My mother and grandmother were institutionalized at residential schools, and I also did a PhD over the course of nearly a decade that looked at the history of Indian residential schooling. And so tonight we're going to go through some of that history. After a short history primer presentation, I'm going to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Sarah Komarniski, and we're going to talk about our work on reconciliation. So this is the historian in me that I am going to share one of my lectures that I gave to my students at the University of Alberta this year. So again, I put a content warning in the chat that if you do need resources, if you do want to talk to Christina, please feel free to reach out. The good thing about being virtual is that you can also just unplug and shut your video off for a little while and step away if you need to. I'm also on rural internet, so I'm going to be shutting my video off while I present. So this workshop was actually conceived in an attempt to get the Langevin school name changed. As we all know, when the news broke out of Kamloops a few weeks ago now, that change happened very, very quickly, despite the ongoing good work that was happening with the reconciliation group in Calgary. We decided to change gears a little bit, focus less on Langevin and more on the history of the system. And this is where it really starts with John A. Macdonald. Historians have come to frame him as one of the architects of genocide. I'm just going to increase my screen size a little bit here. So he was really celebrated as one of Canada's founding fathers, and he was faced with building this settler state that we now live in. That really was possible through a number of factors: land, quote unquote, Wild West, and large-scale integration projects. I did just get a notice that my internet connection is unstable. So I'm going to go ahead and keep on talking. If at some point I need to rejoin the call, I will do that. So John A. Macdonald also served as Superintendent General of Indian Affairs. He had this dual role of nation builder and architect of genocide. And His intent really was, quote, to do away with the tribal system and assimilate the Indian people in all respects speedily as they are fit to change, end quote. And so this is kind of where Langevin fits in, is there was a group of white men who were responsible for the creation of Indian residential schools. And I really encourage you to use that phrase, Indian residential schools. That was the official name of these institutions. That is how the TRC recognized them. So regarding Langevin, in May 1883, Langevin presented a school pilot program in the House of Commons, and he suggested that the federal government create Indian industrial schools. He drew on proof from US schools that had separated Indigenous children from their parents and thought that this system would be effective. Langevin stated that without this separation, Indigenous children would, quote, remain savages, end quote. So Canada did look to the US for their industrial schooling / Indian residential school programming. However, it's important to note that church and missionary run residential schools were in existence in what is now known as Canada since 1620. We also have this key piece of legislation that was enacted in 1876, which allowed for the whole Indian residential schooling program and what would become a genocidal colonial system. So I'm not going to dwell on the indentation. Please feel free to reach out to the organizers and we can make this available. Basically, the impact of the Indian Act was at first assimilation, later it was genocide. It regulated Indian status. So anyone in, again, what is now known as Canada, you needed to be a registered Indian in order to be recognized by the federal government. I will say that the Indian Act still exists, that in order to be recognized under the federal government, you have to apply for this status, and they continue to use oppressive blood quantum theories that actually denies my own daughter to be recognized federally as Indigenous in this country. 1884, there was an amendment that mandated education for Indigenous children at residential schools. A year later, cultural practices such as sundances and potlatch were criminalized. So you could literally go to prison for practicing ceremony. 1894 and 1920, there were amendments made making institutionalization compulsory. If parents rejected sending their students to residential schools, they could be imprisoned, they could be fined, and so attendance was compulsory, which lasted, through to the late 1970s at least. Yeah, so again, not going to dwell here. There's really a lot to talk about the Indian Act. Coming to one of these key figures, one of these key architects of genocide alongside MacDonald and Langevin, we have Duncan Campbell Scott of the Department of Indian Affairs. And he said, our object is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no question and no Indian departments. So we're talking about complete elimination of any Indigenous sovereignty or practices in Canada. So in my history classes, we have a discussion about Thomas More, and some analyze it tonight. But what I will say is Thomas More of Indian residential school policies, and we can pictures. On the left, we have this young Indigenous child in full regalia, standing next to some kind of a fur hide. He is holding a gun, which is meant to highlight his dangerous status, his symbol as a savage. On the right, we have a fully assimilated young man who is, you know, smartly dressed in European garb. His hair has been cut neat and orderly. His shoes are shined. There's also a potted plant next to him, meaning that he's gained full control over his environment and his savage nature. And these kind of photos were used by missionaries and churches to demonstrate the quote unquote good work that happened at residential schools. They were used to show critics that these policies were working, and they were used to generate donations to Indian residential schools. So what did a day at a residential school actually look like for students? Many of the residential schools in southern Canada, and I say that because the residential schools in Northwest Territories, Yukon, and now Nunavut were quite different. And so in southern Canada, most of them practice this half-day system, and only available were grades 1 through 8. Nevertheless, students were generally institutionalized until they were 18 or 19 years old. And so if you were in grades 1 through 8, you engaged in hard labor for half the day. And that would include farming, milking cows, gardening, cleaning, cooking, harvesting lumber, you know, emptying spittoons, etc., laundry, basically anything and everything that needed to be done. Winter, you were harvesting blocks of ice for drinking water, etc. Then you would spend the other half of your day in the classroom receiving a subpar racist curriculum, basically. Once you had completed grade 8, let's say maybe you were 13 or 14, you were still stuck at the residential school generally until you were 18 or 19. And that's when you spent 100% of your time engaged in this kind of labor. For residential schools here in Alberta, some had 500 acres of farm. This would not have been possible if it wasn't for the labor of children. And so we asked, what is it that they wanted to transform these students into? It's difficult because they were often trained to be farmers, but all of the equipment was always subpar. There was never any adequate instruction. There was never the land, like enough land in order to properly make a go at farming. And so they didn't actually learn the things that they needed in order to carry on as farmers once they left residential school. So the maintenance of these residential schools would not have been possible if it wasn't for students. They were overworked, had inadequate provisions and funding. The schools were poorly constructed. The buildings were neglected and inadequately maintained. This meant that the fire hazards were monumental, that there was poor ventilation and disease was able to spread. All of these kinds of concerns. Careless administration of health regulations, and also harsh and alien routines. And so waking up, I was actually just reading some records at the Provincial Archives of Alberta last week, and a dispute that, you know, 4:30 in the morning was too early for the kids to wake up, is what the children were saying, that 4:30 was too early to go milk the cows and get started on the chores. And the operators of the Dunbow school contested this and said, no, 4:30 is not too early. And so the Indian agent became involved, and it was ruled that they would be extended to 4:45 for an extra 15 minutes of sleep. But hard labor from the beginning, and then of course attending church or mass, generally in a foreign language, French or Latin, and then going into the classroom for half a day of school. So as I mentioned, you know, poor building codes, we have overcrowding, poor ventilation, fire hazards, not enough land to actually sustain people, hunger and starvation, malnutrition. If anyone here knows the work of historian Ian Mosby, he has looked into nutritional experiments that happened on children. And I mean, when we look at the causes of death at these institutions, Kamloops, you know, the breaking news last night of the 751 unmarked graves of the Cowessess First Nation, we really start to see what kind of deaths were possible. And so not enough land to grow enough food to sustain the children, food being used as a punishment in the sense of not feeding children enough, led to malnutrition, poor building codes, overcrowding, poor ventilation. All of this led to disease. And, you know, often, like I said, I was looking at the Dunbo records, and often when missionaries suspected that a child was gravely ill, they would send that child home so that death would not be reflected on the school. And I was looking at one year, I think it was 1897 at Dunbo, and 70% of the children in that year that were discharged, they're on the discharge records because they died. So a very violent and harsh place that sometimes resulted in death. But then we also have the influence of Dr. Peter Bryce, a settler MD hired by the Department of the Interior in 1904. And he investigated the conditions at a number of Indian residential schools in 1907. He blamed the Department of Indian Affairs and the federal government for shocking death rates. Approximately 24 to 69% was the death rates at these institutions. And he was later forced into retirement and outed by the Department of Indian Affairs, but he did publish The Story of a National Crime, which you can still read, and I believe that was in 1921 or 1922. So I'm not going to go through the Bryce report in detail. It is definitely something that is available for everyone to read. If you Google it, it is on. This person, you know, sounding the alarm very early, and the federal government not doing anything, the churches not doing anything. So again, I can circulate this PowerPoint. We've touched on death already. There were a number of ways children passed away. A big one was tuberculosis, measles, mumps, influenza. Children sometimes arrived ill. Residential schooling policies said that they needed a medical examination before being admitted to residential schools. That didn't necessarily happen. And of course, we have this lack of love, you know, that really led to loneliness, to runaways, to suicide, all kinds of ways that kids did not survive at these schools. But parents were also an important factor here. Right from the get-go, they were incredibly critical of these policies. Yes, they may have wanted their child to be trained in up-and-coming, you know, wage labor jobs in farming. They knew that the economy was changing. They knew that the world was changing, but they didn't necessarily want their children taken away from them and subjected to all of these conditions. And the result was that when the child returned home, if they were so fortunate to return home, that, you know, they were alienated from their Indigenous culture and their language and their family. But on the other hand, they didn't get the skills that they needed at these residential schools in order to make a go in this new emerging world. So in 1946, there was a special joint committee, and it was recommended that Indian residential schools be closed. They shifted the policy to something called integration. Now, you'll notice that historians like to play with language. You'll hear assimilation, integration. I try not to use those words unless I'm referring to official policies, because a word like integration really downplays the death and the genocidal nature of these institutions. So just a note for language. So in the mid-40s, they froze residential schooling involvement. They refused church requests for increased student capacity. And I mean, these residential schools were a moneymaker for churches. The more students they could institutionalize, the more funding they received. So it was in their best interest to try and get more students year after year. And this 1946 Special Joint Committee brought that to an end. So this policy of integration was meant to signal a slow closure of Indian residential schools and move Indigenous children into provincial schools with everyone else. So that didn't actually happen immediately. As we know, the last Indian residential school closed in 1996. It took about 50 years to wind down the system. And even after that 1946 Joint Committee decision, brand new Indian residential schools were built and opened, mostly in the Northwest Territories, Yukon and Nunavut. So what was behind this 1946 change in vision? I have here, it actually did not reflect a change in vision. It was just new language. And so assimilation and genocide were still the driving factors. So I know that we're now already a few minutes behind schedule, but I just wanted to point to local schools in the TRC. And so there were a number of institutions that operated like residential schools, but were not deemed as such by the TRC. And so here we have the Charles Council Hospital in Edmonton. Work has been underway around the council for a number of years. Dr. Keisha Supernant at the U of A, a couple years ago, she and her team have already started the ground penetrating radar at the council, unofficial graveyard. So all of these conversations are not new for Indigenous people, and they are ongoing. This also works into the 60s. So again, I'm not going to dwell too much here, but the 60s scoop is seen as an extension of the residential schooling policies. There's this approach of take the child first and ask questions later, which is the same as Indian residential schools. Children were removed from their homes that were deemed unfit, and they needed to live with white families so they could learn middle-class Christian values. And so this really calls the concept of caring into question. So these schools were meant to, quote unquote, care for children because their families were apparently not able to. So were the 60s scoop. And in order to find out more about how the system evolved from residential schooling to the 60s scoop to the contemporary child welfare system, I really encourage everyone to look up the work of Cindy Blackstock. And so now the news of Kamloops still seemed pretty fresh in our minds and in our hearts. It was the largest residential school in Canada, and news broke a few weeks ago that there are the remains of approximately 215 children at that former site. And then of course, the Cowessess First Nation last night breaking that there are approximately 751 unmarked graves. The First Nation has been very careful to note that this is not a mass grave, that these are unmarked graves, and they have not finished with the GPR on that site, so that number is likely much higher. So that's kind of my history primer presentation. Now we're going to move to the second part of the evening, which is 150 acts of reconciliation. And I know Sarah, so my friend and colleague, Dr. Sarah Komarniski is on the call right now. And we got together 4 years ago in 2017 as a response to Canada 150. And so Sarah is going to say a few words about herself, but I think for the first time ever, I'm going to read a scripted introduction of Sarah. So Sarah Komarniski is a settler scholar who lives in Yellowknife, Chief Dry Geese Territory, which is the traditional territory of the Yellowknives Dene First Nation. She leads research activities and initiatives for Hotitsida, a patient-oriented and Indigenous health support research units for the Northwest Territories, funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research and hosted by the K'licho government. Dr. Komarniski is also the mother of 2 children, Ingrid and Nils. So Sarah, are you there? Do you want to?
Yeah, I'm here. Hi, Crystal.
Hi.
And hi, everyone. It's really a big honor to be invited in to present and even just to keep doing this work. How many years later now, Crystal? I guess
4.
Since Canada 150, 4 years on, and we're still going, but I think more important than ever. So Crystal and I, as she said, we met, we were both at the University of Alberta in the Department of History. Crystal was working on research on Indian residential schools, and I was working on a project about Indian hospitals and art and craft made by patients at those hospitals. Oh, we skipped our land acknowledgement slide, but it was in my introduction that I'm here on Chief Dry Geese Territory, Yellowknives Dene First Nation territory. The picture on the right, for me anyway, is Labrador tea, which is out flowering right now. And I picked that one because one of the acts on our list is to learn a plant, learn the First Nations, learn the traditional name for the plant and what it's used for, and this one is used to make tea. You can make tea out of the blossoms and the leaves.
Yeah, I think that's really special, Sarah. I really like that photo. Us Dinjiju, we call it muskeg tea. So you go in your rubber boots and find a big patch of moss, and there you will find your Labrador tea growing on the tundra. And you know, I really kind of saved my personal introduction and my land acknowledgement, so Sarah and I could do it alongside with each other. Land acknowledgements should definitely be personalized, and you know, I've now shared this photo on the left a few times of a female moose who really graced us with her presence one night in early April. I think she came in late at the end of our driveway and slept there for the night. And, you know, it just really got me thinking about the ways in which we take care of each other, the ways in which our animal ancestors remind us that this is not our land, that they are here watching over us. And the significance of having her there, you know, I live just south of Enoch, just 5 minutes out of Edmonton, Treaty 6 homeland of the Métis Nation, and her presence really reminded me that I'm in relation with the land and the animal and spirits on an ongoing basis.
For me, seeing the Labrador tea in bloom really reminded me how rich and plentiful the land is here. Like the whole forest is full of tea, basically. It's beautiful.
Amazing.
Anyway, I kind of jumped ahead to this part and how Crystal and I met in the history department. And sorry, I was just so excited And this picture was a really exciting day too, because we were in Crystal's home territory in Sigachek, where she's got roots. And so we met in the history department, and it was Canada 150. And I mean, we were both super frustrated with the really celebratory atmosphere. And I think this year is like that. You know, I mean, a lot of people will cancel Canada Day and not celebrate. And so that year it was really off the hook, right? How many millions were spent on the party, Crystal? I can't remember, but
oh my God, like $500 million in Ottawa for this one-day party.
right? There were Canada 150 branded Band-Aids and ketchup and all kinds of stuff like that. And I think the way Crystal tells it, she got really frustrated and started jotting down ideas on her own, like driving to and from campus. Isn't that right?
Oh yeah, and I mean, I think like frustrated is a very diplomatic way, I think, of how I was feeling. It was just like having all of this stuff shoved in your face, and like the celebration of 150 years of colonialism and genocide. And at that point, like, yes, we had the TRC, but we really weren't having these conversations about, you know, white supremacy and white privilege and the death, like, of children and babies. And so yeah, it started as this just running list that I would do, like driving to the grocery store, like, hey Siri, settlers should do this, like chopping onions, like, hey Siri, like. And once I had a list of like maybe 25 or 30 points, I was like, wow, this could be something. And that's when I reached out to Sarah, because I thought, like, how great would it be not only to work with my friend, but also like to show some leadership that like an Indigenous academic and a settler Ukrainian academic can work together on something that could benefit a lot of people.
Yeah, and thank goodness you did, because these were things that I was wrestling with too. I mean, as you said, the TRC had calls to action, but they were more for governments to implement, and institutions, organizations, but not necessarily down to the individual level. So Crystal and I got together to try to do that, to try to say, like, you know, here's what everybody could do. And I joke sometimes that it's like a no excuses list. I think there's something on there that like actually everyone could do and could start with and could learn and could grow and could work to change the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in an everyday way. So we got together evenings. We both had babies basically at that time. So we would, like, you know, collaborate on the Google Doc after they went to sleep, or get together at each other's houses and brainstorm acts together. And we really tried, like, you know, everything could be like, learn about this, learn about that, read this, read that. But we tried to do our best to also put in things that people could do. So to go out in the world and do together, and encourage people to do those things together with their family, with their friends, with their communities, to gather together and form groups to work towards reconciliation as well. So you can see that in the list, I think.
For sure. And I mean, just for the record, we came up with more than 150. I don't know, there were some that were like kind of jokes, like tongue in cheek, that probably weren't appropriate for like a bigger national audience. And others that, you know, upon reflecting, we should have included. And I think that in 2017, you know, maybe we just weren't brave enough. Maybe we were precarious about language, but if we were to go back, I think we would have used like stronger language. Hey, Sarah?
Yeah, I think so, but I think it also reflects like our own learning on this, right? And the next couple slides are sort of about our own, like just 2 short slides to show like how we've taken up these things. And I think that's part of it, right? And you know, although we wrote the list for everyone, it's a challenge to, well, it's certainly a challenge to me to take these things on, and moving someplace new. I moved here to Sombaquet, Yellowknife in 2018. And it's like starting the list all over again, learning where you are, learning how to live in good relationship there, like learning what you don't know, like understanding the treaty relationship, if there is one where you're living. These things take, it's a long process. It's a lot of work and thought and yeah, where was I going with that? Anyway, we wrote it for ourselves too, basically, and that our own thinking has grown as a result of engaging with this work, as well as, I think, in my part anyway, real dismay about the state of reconciliation over the last few years, to be honest.
Yeah, for sure. And so even though we had crafted this list of 150 acts, we got it out in the world, and I mean, just again, for the record, like, national media was not interested in this. We could not find one paper who wanted to run it, and we're actually grateful for that. We found our friends at Active History, and this now has a permanent home there. And I hear 1,000 unique hits. And so that's also nice to be able to keep track of that. But for sure, a list of 150 things. And Sarah, like, I appreciate your comments. I've come to view this as a practice, not a checklist, because this is something you're going to engage with forever. And so we haven't even done all 150 acts. And it's been a learning process. And so one of the acts was, make reconciliation a family project and complete the items on this list together. And so reconciliation should be something that you can embrace at the gym, at the workplace, at family barbecues. It shouldn't be a scary or intimidating thing. And this really aligned with the Speak Witch Into Me campaign at that time. On the left is my daughter, Quinn. She was maybe, I don't know, maybe like a year and a half old. And then Sarah's daughter, Ingrid, on the right, who was just like really a couple months old. And so a part of my reconciliation was learning my language. So daughter, she, from a mother's perspective. And, when this news broke last night of the mass grave, and at that point we didn't have a number. Honestly, I had received a text from a friend, and so last night I knew it was 600 plus graves, but even at that point, Sarah and I were texting, and we were texting about this presentation, and I just said, like, this slide on language, I mean, what really hits home is that when my nation finds the unmarked grave of our babies and children and ancestors, I'm not even going to be able to console my elders in my own language. And so that is really the magnitude of it for me.
Yeah, and I wanted to share this one because, like, I mean, again, like, these aren't acts that can be easily completed, and you can spend so much time trying to, or not trying to, but like focusing on truly like understanding, for me as a settler, where did I come from? When did my family arrive here, and how that's part of a bigger system. So here in our list, it's about a larger system that sought to dispossess Indigenous peoples from their ancestral lands. And I would say too, like, to link into systems like to white supremacist systems here in Canada, that my family was Ukraine, from what wasn't even Ukraine yet, came to Treaty 6 territory near what is now Edmonton, Treaty 6 and Métis territory. And like, at that time, Indigenous peoples were increasingly confined to reserves so that people like my family could then settle in that space. And over the generations, right, Indigenous kids were kept separate from their rural counterparts, the rural settler counterparts at residential schools, and the racism that sprung up along the way as well. And so I just, there's a lot to unpack here. And I think it's all about unsettling the way that that we settlers anyway tell the stories about our families and how and why we came here, and linking that into the bigger picture, and also listening for other kinds of stories too. And since you know, I've started hearing other kinds of stories about relationships between Cree peoples and Ukrainian peoples in that region, and so understanding those as well. There's a PhD student at the University of Alberta right now who's doing some work on that, Leah Bryson, I think. And I'm fascinated to see what she finds out, because I think it's all about upending the way we think and talk about ourselves in this country as settlers. Yeah, and so like I said, it's, you know, it's been a few years. I had to think back. This is like how poor of a nationalist I am. I couldn't even remember like how many years ago was Canada's 150th birthday. But anyway, since then we've really we've had a chance to reflect on this list and present it many times. Yeah, I don't know, Crystal, if you wanted to start sharing some reflections here.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the things that we've grappled with after writing this list, so many people have asked us like, oh, are you going to write another one? And the answer is always no. Like literally Act 150 is like, make your own list, or why don't you write number 151? So the answer is no, because this list thought in time. And a lot of things have happened since then. And, you know, after the TRC, after Justin Trudeau was elected on his promises about reconciliation, we have the federal government literally buying a pipeline. We have a justice system that acquits Gerald Stanley for the murder of Colton Boushie. We have the firing of Jody Wilson-Raybould. So many other things. You know, as academics, we look at how people have taken up the report from the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And I mean, honestly, it has been crickets. Sarah, do you want to explain the rest of the slides?
Yeah, we've also got, you know, an image that says justice for Joyce Echaquan, who died, you'll recall, in Quebec. Our government also literally bought a pipeline, right? It's yeah, that's where we've been at over the last few years, and of course recently, the graves of residential school students, of Indian residential school students being discovered, even though, you know, these recommendations were put forward in the TRC report in 2015 to like put funds behind this, to find these grave sites and support communities in doing that, right? For my own part, I mean, I often like will write a letter. I'll write a letter to different levels of government and ask for action on the calls to action. And this year I got a letter back that basically just bumped the letter around to different people. I had written it to the Prime Minister, and it was like referred to Carolyn Bennett, and I didn't get a response for like almost a year. And it's enraging actually, to pay attention and to see these things happen, and to see that things have been changing so slowly.
Yeah, and everything is frustrating. And I mean, when we're talking about Indigenous issues, we're also talking about Black issues, about the inequality in this country. And so one of the acts is, you know, learn about and support Black Lives Matter. And at the murder of George Floyd, there was an incredible amount of activism. And on the left here is a patch that my cousin Margaret designed, and then her mother, my Sheiji, my cousin Agnes Mitchell, beaded. And this one act of you know, having a patch beaded doesn't seem like a lot, but it really opened up a conversation in our family about Black Lives Matter and about what that means, and anti-Black racism in Indigenous communities. And so I think you'll find as you work through this list, and I mean, maybe you want to start with Black Lives Matter, like that would be actually a very fine act to start with. You'll notice that these little gestures, that something that seems so simple as learning about an Indigenous plant in your backyard can really spark some big transformative conversations.
Yeah, and that's a beautiful way to put it, Crystal. I love that. I think too that, you know, it's open enough that the act on Black Lives Matter, I think, is support Black Lives Matter. And so how you do that, you need to do the work to find that out, right? And that's all part of it. And so I love that you said that this is a practice, not a checklist. And so and so it's in that spirit again.
For sure. And again, I can see we're already running, or we're still running behind schedule, rather, so much to talk about. And so Sarah and I have actually given this workshop dozens of times now, I think, Sarah, over the last 4 years. And we're happy to do this work. But we always select some acts from the list, right? Really important social issues today. And so here we've extracted some of our acts to better understand Indian residential schools, because what this last month has shown us is that this conversation is not going away. Rather, it is just getting started. And so what better time than now to do this work? And so Sarah, maybe I'll read the first 4 and then you can finish off this slide. And so number 8 is find out if there was a residential school where you live, memorize its name, and visit its former site if appropriate. Here we added if appropriate because if Indigenous communities are undertaking research or ground penetrating radar, they do not need a bunch of people arriving at their site. Number 23, although Gord Downey significantly contributed to the conversation about Indian residential schools, consider why some Indigenous people might not support his project. Number 27, which Sarah and I have both used with our children, buy some books for your children that explain the histories and legacies of residential schools.
That one, honestly, I'm so glad to have books like that, because as a settler, it means that I'm not off the hook. Like there's one book about Orange Shirt Day that became my daughter's favorite book, and yeah, we read it many times, and I don't think we would have talked about it every night before bed in that way. Anyway, just a note. Number 46, read the TRC. Seriously, start with the calls to action. Read the executive summary. You can even listen to the executive summary online. I believe there's still a YouTube playlist. It's hyperlinked in our list at Read the TRC, but read it. Number 146, familiarize yourself with Cindy Blackstock's important work. She's one of my biggest heroes, and once you learn about her work, I'm sure she'll be yours as well. And number 112, again, make reconciliation a family project and complete items on this list together. Bring people in, do this with others, have conversations. That's what it's all about.
Yeah, and so one of the acts is understand that reconciliation is not about feeling guilty. It's about knowledge, action, and justice. And so as a historian who has spent my whole life overwhelmed with media interviews since Kamloops, I've done about 55 media engagements in the last 3 weeks. And one of the things that I was saying to a reporter today is that, yes, it's perfectly normal to feel shame. It's perfectly normal to feel sad, to feel guilty. I mean, all of those things are normal emotions when you're processing the deaths of 1,000 Indigenous people over the last few weeks. But that's not the point of reconciliation. We aren't trying to make you feel guilty. We're trying to bring justice to our people, and we're trying to get people to act. Yeah, for sure. So we've designed a workshop that we're going to go into breakout rooms now. Sarah, I realize that like we don't ever really talk about the posters a lot. Do you maybe like want to give like a 20-second, like a 20-seconder about the posters?
In our shortened presentation, we took the posters out, but we do sell posters. We sell 150 acts of reconciliation posters. The beautiful art, and you can see like some of the elements of the art on the screen were created by Leanne Marie Charlie. She's an artist, an Indigenous artist from Yukon, and they're available on our website, and I'll send it to Sarah to put in the chat here right away. And they have all 150 acts on there, and this is another good way to share this with others in your space if you're interested. All of the proceeds for the poster go to a scholarship to support an Indigenous student at the University of Alberta.
Awesome. Okay, so right now I'm going to stop sharing. And I'm going to look to Sarah to give us information about the breakout groups. Yeah,
so we have set up some rooms for everyone to go into. I'm going to put the notes in the chat with what the instructions Crystal just gave.
Oh, I think you're muted, Sarah.
Classic. Sorry. Thank you so much to both of you for speaking. This was really, important. So thank you. So everyone is going to receive an invitation to a breakout room. So once you're in there, there's a facilitator assigned to each room. I put some instructions in the chat, so people should be able to see that when they go into their room as well. And Crystal, how much time were you thinking? I think we have about 20 minutes left. So if we said like 10 minutes in the groups?
I think if we had 10 minutes for the group and then we can come back as a bigger group and talk about it, that would be fantastic.
Okay, wonderful. So I'm just going to open the breakout rooms now. And you should be getting your invitation. If you're having trouble, just hang back in the room with me and I can, I can help you out.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back. I hope you had a good time, good conversation in the breakout rooms. Again, because we're shorter on time than expected, I just want to put it out to see if anyone wants to share something from their conversation in the breakout rooms. Given that we don't have a lot of time, we can take a couple of examples. Any brave person out there? Oh, hi, Kayla B.
Okay, well, in our group, we introduced ourselves, and it was, lovely to hear. We were all aware of the place where we live and work, and two of us chose the family connection to do some research to find out how our families relate to the whole Indigenous question. And colonialism, and two of us vowed to read the, vowed to read the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation report. And one would read it with her children, and that actually might be a good one to start with. There's a special version of it with simplified language. Maybe that would be a good one to start with, even if if you're an adult.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's a great way to engage with the work of the TRC, is to start by reading that work. We heard from one more group, and then we'll move to closing. And sorry about that.
I think I saw in the chat that Stovall is interested in sharing.
Shelley has a hand up. Hi, Shelley.
We'll go with the person in the chat. That's okay.
Oh, is there anyone in the chat?
Yeah, I just got a direct message about Beth Stovall. So wherever Beth is.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm happy to share about our group quickly. We talked about the work of hearing voices and learning stories of the people in this area. We've also talked about how we can write letters to our government officials around actually enforcing the calls to action for the TRC. And we talked also about learning our own histories in relationship to the land that we're in, the stories of our family's immigration, but also the land that they settled in. How did they gain that land? Who were the people in that land? And what is the story of that place? And so those were some of the key things that we talked about.
Well, thank you for sharing. While you're writing letters, someone I read on Facebook today was also suggesting writing letters to encourage the churches to release the records on residential schools. So I'm going to write a letter about that too. I'm going to commit to that in front of all of you as well, an additional act. But with that, and I'd love to hear more. I'm sure you all had such great conversations with each other. With that, I'd just like to move to say thank you, Masi Cho, to everyone for joining us today. Crystal's going to share a thank you slide, and she probably wants to say thank you too.
Thanks so much. This is really usual. You know, the circumstances that bring us to these conversations are not always ideal, but thank you. I appreciate you all, your time. Thank you so much to the students who ran our session tonight and to the Reconciliation Action Group.
Thank you, Sarah and Crystal, for presenting that great presentation.
We'd also like to thank this evening's sponsors who funded and promoted and supported this, which include the Alberta Assembly of Social Workers, the Calgary Alliance for the Common Good, the Faculty of Social Work, part of the University of Calgary, Teach Me, which is part of Brentwood Cares, the Women's Centre of Calgary, and Work Together Ending Poverty.
We also wish to thank Elder Adrian Wolflag, who shared this evening with us and who will be offering a closing prayer. No? Okay.
He's not.
Is he?
Oh, no, I think he's left.
Oh, okay. So he left.
So yeah, on behalf of the Reconciliation Action Group, we'd like to thank everybody for coming, and we hope you have a good night.